First up, after a long holiday weekend of the media and American public playing Did He or Didn't He with that Atlantic article claiming Trump called Americans killed in war losers and suckers, asked that wounded veterans be kept out of military parades, and most rational people deciding he probably did say at least something along those lines, the president's former fixer is pouring salt into the wound with his new book out today, Disloyal, a Memoir. In it, Michael Cohen tells of how he heard Trump make racist comments about Barack Obama and Nelson Mandela, among others. And he calls Trump a cult leader, telling NBC News that's why people defend the indefensible, saying, quote, when you're in the Trump cult, you have no choice but to accept it. But when this is your chief defender...
Donald Trump has the greatest amount of respect for the men and women of our armed forces.
I think you have a problem. Because this is a woman who admitted to Robert Mueller that she's lied to the press and the American people on more than one occasion. And there are plenty of other people who could say this story isn't true, but have not. It's largely just the president himself.
The story is a hoax written by a guy who's got a tremendously bad history. The magazine itself, which I don't read, but I hear it's just totally anti-Trump. It's a disgrace. Who would say a thing like that? Only an animal would say a thing like that. There is nobody that has more respect for not only our military, but for people that gave their lives in the military.
Just so I'm clear, he's saying no one has more respect for our military and people who gave their lives than a guy who's frequently disparaged the Khans, whose son was killed in Iraq, and famously said this about John McCain.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
And then there's Trump's well-known abhorrent treatment of his own high-ranking former staff from the military, like retired General John Kelly, his once chief of staff, who was reportedly barely on speaking terms with the president when he left, and retired General James Mattis, the former defense secretary, who Trump once called the world's most overrated general. And even as he defends himself against this article, he goes ahead and makes statements like these.
I'm not saying the military is in love with me. The soldiers are. The top people in the Pentagon probably aren't, because they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else stay happy.
But if you're still on the fence about who's telling the truth here, consider this claim Trump made about how upset he was that he couldn't visit the Ain Marne American Cemetery, which the Atlantic reported he chose not to do because it would mess up his hair, but which the White House claims was because of weather making it impossible for him to go.
I called home. I spoke to my wife. I said, I hate this. I came here to go to that ceremony.
He called home, but the thing is, Melania Trump was with him in France at the time. And if you're still on the fence, well, my next guest has a lot more history on the president's relationship with the military, which he laid out this weekend. I'm joined by Michael Kranish. He's national political investigative reporter for the Washington Post, which many of us endearingly call Boston Globe South. Michael, good to see you. How are you?
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So most of us thought the first signs of Trump's anti-military animus was 2015, I like people who aren't captured, 2016, when he took on the Khans, the Gold Star family I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. In your piece, you go far further back, actually, to his upbringing. What's the thesis of those who believe that's where it all happened?
Well, it's really interesting. You know, he did grow up in a family where, according to some family members, there was a disdain for military service. Why would you go into the military if you could make a lot of money as a business person in the Trump family business? So Mary Trump, who wrote, of course, this recent best-selling book, very critical of her uncle Donald Trump, says that Donald Trump disparaged her father, Fred Trump Jr., for joining the military. He was in the Army National Guard. And that, would have sent a message, within the family. Nonetheless, Donald Trump was sent to the New York Military Academy for 5 years. And this was a pretty brutal environment, according to other classmates. And I quoted one in the story who went with Donald Trump. One of their mothers would drive them from Jamaica Estates and Queens. And he recalls that, this was just a very difficult environment to be in. Trump was sent there away from his family at the age of 13 and then for 5 years. So he thinks, this classmate, that this also stoked some kind of animus. What we do know for sure is that Donald Trump did avoid service in Vietnam. He had student deferments. And then when the draft lottery was instituted starting in 1969, he drew a 356 out of 365 number. He also had a deferment due to what he called bone spurs in his heels. So he he did not serve in Vietnam, and he actually went on various radio shows to congratulate himself and others for not serving in Vietnam, which he said was not a war worth fighting.
And speaking of those bone spurs, you mentioned that in Michael Cohen's new book, Disloyal, that at the beginning of the campaign, Cohen asked him for the medical records, and because Trump is concerned that he will be asked questions. And what does Trump say to then his trusted consigliere?
Well, according to Cohen, and he mentioned this in sworn testimony before the House last year, in fact.
Right.
Yeah, and he said, he asked Trump, well, if I got to defend you, can you give me the military records, the medical records? And Trump said there are no medical records. I didn't have surgery on the bone spurs. And then by the campaign's own account, these didn't last that long. He then got that high lottery number, which helped him avoid service. So a series of events occurred that enabled him to avoid service.
So let's go from youth to 1993. He's on with Howard Stern. Everything seems to happen with Howard Stern. And he appears to be comparing the fear of STDs to some experiences that a soldier might have. Here's youngish Donald Trump.
You know, if you're young and in this era, and if you have any guilt about not having gone to Vietnam, right? We have our own Vietnam. It's called the dating game.
So you fast... and by the way, later he also had the experience with Stern a couple of years later where he complimented one of Stern's staff who had gotten out of the military apparently for fake reasons. Can you not say that there was an odd sense of humor, maybe offensive to some, but maybe didn't really show where Trump was coming from? Is that a stretch?
Well, I mean, certainly on a radio show like that, he wants to be humorous, but, there was a lot of factual basis from Trump's standpoint in what he was saying. He has said many times that he didn't want to serve in Vietnam, that he didn't think this was a war worth fighting for, has talked about that ever since. And on one of the radio shows you mentioned, this person was said to have had a bad knee, and he said, good job, for basically getting out of the service. And, in fairness, a lot of people did not want to serve in the Vietnam War because they truly believed there's not a just cause. Some people went as conscientious objectors. They went to Canada. And people did do a lot, to avoid the war. In his case, there's been this question, did he really have bone spurs? Was that really something that, was a real medical issue? New York Times has reported that, according to the two daughters of the podiatrist who gave this diagnosis, this was done as a favor to Donald Trump's father, who was the podiatrist landlord. So that also raised some questions.
So in 1999, he's doing 60 Minutes 2 with Dan Rather, and he makes and he's contemplating running on the Reform Party ticket for the presidency. He makes a comment that is more muted about John McCain than the one he made a decade and a half later. Here he is.
He was captured.
And he flew combat missions.
Question: does being captured make you a hero? I don't know. I'm not sure.
So he wasn't sure in 1999. He was quite sure in 2015. What happened in the intervening 16 years?
Well, I think the important thing about that 60 Minutes 2 interview, and I say the 2 because it wasn't as well known as 60 Minutes. The show was not as well remembered. So a lot of people don't remember that interview. It just wasn't nearly as highlighted as some other interviews. But what that shows is that he was already thinking, I want to use something against John McCain. Everybody else would say, is a huge plus. Who could question the courage of someone, during torture and confinement for 5.5 years, being shot down. And yet there's Trump basically raising this question. So whether you raise it as a question or you state it directly, you're still impugning the service of that individual. So the fact that he hardened his rhetoric, is, I think, a little bit less significant than the fact that he first raised this issue in 99. I think a lot of people probably didn't realize that back in 99, 16 years before the better-known comments, he was basically raising the same issue. Raising it as a question is sort of a Trumpian thing, like some people say, some people ask. So it had the same effect. If you didn't know about the 2015 comments, you'd be very surprised by the 1999.
Well, but there's also something else that you write about you'd be surprised about in terms of an evolution, for lack of a better word. He gives $1 million to the creation of Vietnam Memorial. I think it's 1985, you say. And his comments in 1985 at the dedication are very different from the comments of Citizen Trump later, and clearly different from President Trump. What did he say there, and what happened in between there?
Well, in 1985, he said that he spent a fortune. It was actually $1 million, according to reported by the Post, for a Vietnam Veterans Memorial in New York City. So he deserves credit for that. But he said he did this because he felt, his word, guilty, quote unquote, for not having served in Vietnam. He thought this assuaged that guilt to some degree. Yeah. And he gave a very statesman-like speech at that dedication. He talked about the great sacrifice these people have made. He said, I wasn't a supporter of the Vietnam War, but these people who fought should be honored, I'm paraphrasing. And he also read a letter from then President Reagan about people who were missing in action. So, really you couldn't quarrel with what he said at that time, but it certainly stands in stark contrast to the way he's quoted as saying things later on. So, why that changed, the way he has talked about this, it does, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of a Trump supporter, so we want to be very fair here, he has talked about ending endless wars. And so he's been very critical of those who carried out the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, saying these are endless wars. Of course, he hasn't ended some of these later wars, Iraq and Afghanistan himself. But, that is something that was, according to a historian, something that he was using as a campaign platform and is trying to use again. So that informs a lot of what he's talking about. But as far as, going after, for example, John McCain, that seems an effort to undermine a particular person who's critical of him, not just the endless wars aspect.
By the way, that endless war thesis that you write about, suggesting that that's appealing to the base that has disdain, I think is the word you use for endless wars, or at least the person you quoted, Andrew Bacevich, who obviously served in Vietnam. He's been on the show here many times. Maybe this is outside of your lane, an expression I hate. I don't know why I even use that. That is a bit, I have great respect for Andrew Bacevich. That is a bit of a stretch. Is it not, to suggest that's what the agenda really is here when he's disparaging leaders of the Pentagon, disparaging Mattis, disparaging General Kelly, don't you think?
Well, in fairness to Mr. Bacevich, he said, however bizarre, maybe this is the way Trump's thinking about it. So just to put that in perspective, he didn't say this explains everything. He said, if you're trying to look at it from Trump's best perspective, maybe that's what he was thinking.
Can we stay outside your lane for a minute? And obviously, if you don't want to go there, it's fine. I am amongst the many who thought the comment about McCain in 2015 was a campaign killer. The comments about the Khan family were clearly campaign killers. And by the way, Keezer Khan will be with me here Thursday night. We all know the Fifth Avenue comment. He wouldn't lose a vote if he shot somebody. Do you have any thoughts on whether or not this latest thing out of the Atlantic and confirmation of places as far afield as Fox News are going to damage this guy?
Sorry, a lot of people thought the Hollywood Access tape also, was a campaign killer. On and on. I mean, he's certainly shown again and again that that base is going to support him. The question is that base big enough to win him re-election? I remember in 2016, I had co-authored the Post biography called Trump Revealed about Trump. I went down to, I think it was North Carolina, and I interviewed people who were Trump supporters and basically said, he says things that, everyone basically agrees this is untrue or misleading. Do you care? And what time and again I was told is we just want him to go there and blow things up. We know he exaggerates. We know some of the things he says don't check out. And they didn't really care about that. And there are probably a lot of people who don't care in that way. They like what he does. So certainly as a political reporter who's covered a lot of campaigns where people were declaring the campaign's over and they weren't over. We all remember Dukakis being up 17 points way back when.
Yes, we do.
Right? Of course. So, there's still a lot of people who support him, and we are respectful for that. We report, what's going on. The campaign is so far from being over, Jim, as you know very well. So, I think the thing to do on both sides, and I've written a lot of stories about Joe Biden as well and other candidates before in the primaries, is you continue to vet them. And I think that's what, our job is, to really let people know, here's what's happened. The Atlantic wrote their story. The assignment that I had was not to write about Atlantic, but to say, well, what's the history here? To, go back. And as we discussed earlier, those 99 comments about McCain, were there long before the more recent comments. So, there's history there for people to digest and to understand. And I think it's always good to go back and look at the formative years. Even now, there's still things that, even though I co-wrote a biography, I'm still learning, about Donald Trump. People who didn't want to talk last time are talking this time. So there's always new things to learn, and I think it hopefully provides a service to readers and your viewers.
I learned a lot myself, Michael Kranish. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for your work. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim.